Welcome to Systems Philosophy. In the previous episodes, we have been exploring the links between culture, technology, and humanity's success. Culture provides a data storage, a memory that exists outside of genetic memory and outside of the individual mind. It is monkey see, monkey do, imitation in the wordless sense, learning from parents and peers, to pass on lessons that ultimately mean you don't need to learn firsthand. Your behaviors can become fine-tuned over time. Okay. We've been considering that the cultural advantages, especially with humans as a cultural specialist, having developed speech for more effective cultural transmission and given up on the biological specialities of claws and teeth, having become perhaps a specialist in bipedal walking, in object manipulation with hands, in heat dissipation through all-body perspiration, and to be able to be partially aquatic. So we do have, and we're also a specialist in being able to heal from injuries. So we do still have our biological specialities, but the main speciality we have is we are a carrier and transmitter of culture. That was a big part of the primate niche from which we came. Troops of monkeys, chimpanzees, gorillas, carrying culture within the collective and acting as a collective unit, as a tribe, as a band. Individuals still live and die within that band, but the overall troop carries the culture, and if the troop is exterminated or disbanded and absorbed into other troops, then that particular entity ceases to exist, much like a multicellular organism ceases to exist, although subtly different, of course, because with our bodies, we can have the majority of the cells still alive, and yet the systems that maintain the overall body's integrity stops, and therefore cell death follows, because the body's information field has been disrupted to the point where it can't recover. So from the ship of Theseus perspective, it is the structure that's been disrupted. And even though after death fingernails and hair still keep growing, and many cells will die slowly over days, even weeks, as the body putrefies, it's the system overall that we view. Okay, that's been a little bit of a divergence. One of the advantages of culture is that it allows humans to remember and share information through speech and stories, song and dance, and also to master construction of tools, which we classify as technology collectively. Anything we do that involves the construction of things not of our own bodies is technological by definition. In order to construct better technology, we, through trial and error, through experimentation and technological evolution, can improve technology. And the history of stone flints in the record show that cultures have different generations of flint knapping techniques. In deep prehistory, in the Stone Age, different techniques used to be associated with different peoples. So we call the group of Stone Age American early ancestors as the Clovis people, because the type of flint knapping was through the Clovis spear, the Clovis sort of spearhead and arrowheads. Clovis being an archaeological name usually associated with the site of first discovery. We don't actually know anything about the culture of these people other than the technological artifacts that they left behind. The point we've been leading to is that culture through technology and shared lessons and our speciality in culture has made the human species very successful. And one of the things that means you can carry more technology in your culture and more history, more lessons, is memory. And the theme of the previous couple of episodes has been looking into the value of cultural memory and the evolutionary survival imperative in getting more memory. And part of that has been solved through no longer splitting troops in two and then automatically seeing the other as the enemy, as us and them, but being able to conserve cultural connections across tribes, across individual settlements, if you like. That allows the tribe to live within the reasonable carrying capacity of the land and not limit its cultural memory capacity to its own capability. We sort of have a mesh network architecture, a sort of shared intelligence, much like ants as an individual are not very intelligent beings, yet the behavior that their biology embodies through the ant hive collectively stores and computes a lot of complex problems and gives a survival advantage beyond what the individual ant can. That's why so often we consider the social insects as being a sort of distant relative. They have solved a similar problem to what humanity has through culture and technology, or a social mammal who has become a cultural specialist. And instead of individual, well, within the tribe, individual people network like ants in an ant hive, bees in a beehive, ants in an ant nest colony. But even ants of the same species will not cooperate. They will compete for territory, and the same has been true of mammals, even primates, with the anthropology of chimpanzees. We as humans have learnt to cooperate and to form coalitions. Okay. We have also explored the possibility of growing beyond the carrying capacity of the land by becoming nomadic tribesmen. And I've followed the plausible history of deep humanity moving from primates to Homo species in previous episodes, and I won't repeat that. And we've moved from scavenger to predator to apex predator to herdsmen and to mastery of animals through riding and harnessing the animals as beasts of burden. And from there we can move on to agriculture and the ox-drawn plough as a way to deliberately modify the environment through agriculture and farming, increasing the percentage of ecology that humanity can harvest. Because when it comes to plants, there's very few plants in the green abundance around me that I can actually eat and gain calories from. I'm not a herbivore or a browser. Agriculture and agricultural selection has, pardon me, produced more palatable and digestible species. So we have co-evolved and even directed the evolution through selection of certain varieties that we can still find wild. Mustards and Bruxias form the basis for much of our food crops, as do grains, which no longer resemble the wild grains that our ancestors might have wild harvested. What I wish to talk about as the main body of today's discussion is pre-agriculture, the standard story that we are all taught that sits within the modern zeitgeist, the mythology, is we went from hunter-gatherers and discovered agriculture and settled down. Now, I've already shown that hunter-gatherers can have been nomadic herdsmen, so they may still have gathered things from the forest, mushrooms and fruits and nuts. They're the main things that we eat, and some spices, herbs from which we flavour our stews and brew our teas and make our medicine. So, hunter-gatherers, we can have a larger tribal group if that tribal group is nomadic, and we need not follow great herds. In fact, part of a nomadic strategy is a seasonal form of nomadic strategy. So in the heat of the summer, you camp by the foreshore of a lake or a sea and harvest that zone. You enjoy the fact that the warm weather lets you enter the water and fish and swim, enter the swamps and harvest turtle, harvest the roots of swamp plants like kumbunji, cattails, which are one of the wild but still semi-domesticated forms of plant that provide starchy roots, high protein pollen, and even a highly absorbent fluff from the flowering head. We can harvest things like wild rice, which the Native Americans harvested from their bamboo. In the autumn, we can move into the woodlands, harvest the fruits and the nuts. In the winter, there might be an area that is less cold, where we overwinter. Depending on the climate, we might drop in altitude. Otherwise, we might prepare fruits, nuts, and the meat we hunted in autumn inside sort of winter cabins where we continue to hunt. But a lot of the food is food that was gathered in autumn. The hunt is harder because winter, especially when there's snow, means there's less game around, and so we go to overwintering grounds, and then in the spring we have the abundance of new growth. Not much fruit, but most animals start to breed, and so we get eggs, which is the basis of the Easter festival. We get young, which are often less capable to run away and can be more easily hunted. And so the annual cycle, which can be an annual migration cycle over tribal lands. So the tribe protects its lands fiercely, and we'll get into conflict and war at a further stage, another episode. But one other driver for greater numbers is that there is strength in numbers. And a tribe that is twice as big as another tribe will be feared and therefore can hold more territory. So in terms of the evolutionary dynamics, it's not just that culture wants more memory, it's that holding territory and holding your own against your neighbours who covet your territory also wants more. Cooperation between tribes helps with war. So if you can band together against a threat, then you become more feared. You become more likely to succeed and therefore more likely to persist and reproduce against those who don't. So there's another evolutionary dynamic. One of the not so spoken of differences between the hunter-gatherer, which I described in the sort of nomadic tribal lands where you seasonally migrate over vast territory so that you can carry larger numbers and therefore more memory, is that humans, as we gain intelligence and gain in cultural memory, will begin disturbing the lands we visit and modifying the landscape. We will quickly learn that if we overhunt, we will hunt the preferred food source to, if not extinction, to scarcity. And cultural memory will then build cultural taboos on when and how much can be hunted. We will easily learn that the fruits we like to eat will seed from both the seeds that we discard, and often the seeds will pass through our guts and seed in the nutrient-rich feces. And coming back after a season, we will notice that our previous camps will have conveniently sprung the sort of plants that we covet. And over time, we will both passively modify the landscape, like any animal does within the ecology. There are birds that eat certain fruits, and the fruits who will only seed when digested in the guts of those birds. The Australian cassowary is a good example because it's a tropical Australian bird, like the emu, that carries the foods in a tight sort of symbiosis between certain species that it likes to eat. The same is true of birds who eat fruits and then defecate the seeds of those fruits and spread the seeds of the trees who make the fruits. In fact, bird species are vital in re-establishing ecological balance. So humanity, even without culture and intellect, just by establishing the nomadic tribal lifestyle, seasonal migration instead of migration with herds, will automatically begin to establish that sort of reflexive self-feedback dynamic, the sort of systems interaction that has been common throughout this series. But we have something more. We have intelligence and we have cultural memory. So we might realize that By burying our feces, not only do we reduce the chances of illness, but we also note that the toilet grounds have sprouted trees that wouldn't grow from feces left on the surface. We deduce that planting seeds helps them grow. We start to build a horticultural body of knowledge. And so what hasn't been spoken about much when we talk about the transition from hunter-gatherer to agriculture is, I believe, there was a vast prehistory of horticulture, of deliberate human modification of the landscape. The forests of Europe are rich in oak and chestnut, species that humans can use. We can eat the starches in oak if they're treated appropriately by soaking in running streams. But more importantly, the acorns feed pigs and deer and fatten them up for the winter. And so by favouring oak and chestnut, we not only provide reserve food source for ourselves, we also improve the hunting. And that can be done deliberately, and modifying the forest landscape is called silviculture. And I'm certain that the prehistorical ancestors of both Europe and North America and South America practiced extensive silviculture. There's a book called The Biochar Solution. I may have butchered that name. It describes the black soils in South America, how these soils don't need fertilizer. They seem to regenerate themselves. It's like a self-fertilizing soil technology that predated colonization. So the idea that South America was basically rainforest tribes that hunted monkeys and ate fruits and perhaps practiced slash and burn agriculture is not the true history. That book takes a reference from a Franciscan monk that accompanied a group of Spaniards that were the first to travel through the Amazon. They arrived on the west coast, went over the Andes, and then down through the Amazon basin to the east coast, travelling most of the way along the river. And the records for this monk, and I don't have the names, unfortunately, but the record exists, documented how the banks of the rivers they were travelling would have regular villages every 5 or 10 kilometres and irregular cities gleaming in the rainforest background every 50 or so kilometres. There is now LiDAR evidence of vast earthworks all over the Amazon rainforest. LiDAR is a laser-based technology that allows you to map ground through vegetation and see contours at a detail not previously possible. And so we can see all the earthworks that were previously hidden by the rainforest canopy. So there is vast evidence that humanity existed in a sort of horticultural Garden of Eden interaction with the environment. There is also evidence that biologists have documented in that the frequency of fruit and nut trees in the Amazon rainforest is tenfold as many as you would expect if it was just natural hunter-gatherer tribal. It shows that the species diversity, even after 400 years, reflects deliberate human intervention in the ecology. We get examples from the Pacific Islanders, the Hawaiian Islands, which had an system of cultivation called the Ohana system, if my memory serves me correctly. Their tribal lands were delineated by the watersheds. Being largely volcanic, the islands would have ridges that surrounded them with a central peak or cone, and each tribe owned the valley between two ridges, the watershed, and the watershed was vertically divided from the tops of the mountains to the sea. The tops of the mountains were sacred. They were left to nature. These were the steep lands, subject to landslides, and people went into them and perhaps harvested wild things, but they didn't disturb the ecology. Next level down, they would have things like taro ponds, where they managed stream flows and grew taro, which is a tropical root rich in carbohydrates, as a staple energy source. Then, next level down, they would have the village, where they would have things like coconut trees, which went right down to the seashore. At the seashore, they modified the landscape into fish ponds, into a whole reef ecology that they harvested. So here's more example of pre-agriculture, sophisticated landscape engineering and ecological management. I'm going to push through a bit with this episode and make it a bit longer than my previous one. We're nearly there. The Australian Aborigines, the first inhabitants of this country, were said to be primitive hunter-gatherers with no technology other than Stone Age technology, the boomerang and the spear. When the first colonists started to venture into the land, and this is from a book called The Dark Emu, which is a collection of colonial diary stories and historical accounts that paints the native culture in a different light. One of the amazing descriptions is that the countryside looked like parkland. It was so fertile that the soils, the horses' hooves sunk up to the fetlocks in the deep, rich soil. The grasslands, even in the desert, were rich and abundant. And Burke and Wills, one of the earliest and ill-fated desert exploration expeditions, gathered water by tying cloths to their ankles and walking through the rich desert grasslands. There's documented evidence of desert Aboriginal tribes harvesting a plant called nadu, which grows on the ephemeral lakes, which flood after a heavy rain and then dry out and provide a sort of receding, fertile, moist edge where this creeping plant can grow that grows seeds, which are like a grain. And the Aboriginal natives constructed shelters that they lined with clay to provide long-term food stores for times of famine and need. So in Western Victoria, there's extensive modification of wetlands for eel traps and fish traps, and evidence of smoking trees where eels were smoked, showing a whole industry built around eels. Sections of river where the river shallowed were modified so that fish could be easily harvested from the landscape. So there's plenty more examples. My main point here is that before humanity settled on agriculture, we practiced environmental modification closer to horticulture, gardening. The Garden of Eden story might have been a historical reflection of the transition from that sort of horticultural lifestyle where you don't deliberately toil with the oxen and the plough. You slowly and over generations guide and modify the landscape. The same might be true of our historical memory of elves. Elves, of course, is a Tolkien fantasy invention, but we know that humanity had different subspecies, if you like, even different species. Neanderthals, Denisovians are some of the more recent ones, but prehistory there would have also been different cultures. And the common mythology of the elves is that they were horticulturalists, people who lived within nature and the forest and lived with harmony instead of the disruption and exploitation of agriculture and the plough, which is still harmonious to a degree. But now with soil and ecological studies, we understand that turning the earth over each season depletes nutrients and carbon. Our ancestors had fallow years, and now we have fertilizers. But in the end, agriculture is destructive and must be, well, it's a whole rabbit hole to go down to. Whereas horticulture is regenerative. We now have a whole field of horticultural research called regenerative agriculture, rediscovering the sort of systems that don't require the inputs, that don't degrade the fertility of the land. And so the main point has been that in the search for more cultural memory, humans have developed technologies in the form of cultural traditions, how we harvest, where we go, where we live, when we hunt, to keep us from over-exploiting the ecology that we are modifying and maintaining. We have also invented technologies, from the simple Aboriginal digging stick, which harvested yams. And there's also stories in this Dark Emu book about women in long lines working their way across plains, harvesting baskets of yams as if they'd been planted. But the practice wasn't to plant. It was simply not to harvest everything in the field, to leave enough so that the next season, when you came back and you reharvested that piece of natural landscape, the plant that you had harvested had regenerated. So in a way, it's a form of landscape gardening, a perpetual agriculture, regenerative agriculture. See, the framings and the labels can shift, and by shifting our perceptions, we can also shift our understandings. Okay, I've gone longer than I want to with these episodes, but I felt that this was a sort of topic that was best kept intact. This has been Systems Philosophy.